Summer. It's that time that nostalgia comes back for all those good times when you were growing up, spending time out in the sunshine and running and playing. I remember that my older brother Charles and my younger brother Clark and I used to run rampant in the summer and do everything we wanted to do. We lived in our teen years in a 20-acre spread in Severna Park, Maryland, right on Benfield Road, and the land went all the way back to the Severn River. And we would climb trees and run and jump over logs, build forts, play in the creek down at the end of the ravine, and stand at the bluff underneath the oak tree and watch the sailboats going down the Severn River. Now, both of my brothers and my father have passed away from polycystic kidney disease. And several years after my older brother Charles passed, I decided I was going to take a trip down to the old homestead. Well, driving down Benfield Road, it did not look the same as it did when I was a kid. The old house was gone, obviously, and on that 20 acres of property, there must have been 30 McMansions. And I found the way, drove into the suburbs there, into the houses, and the name of the street I was on was Rivendell Road. And then there was Rivendell Court. And if you know, you know. And if you don't, you need to read Tolkien. I drove around, and in the cul-de-sac down in the bottom, I could see where the ravine was and where the stream was going through. So I parked the car, and I walked down. And I was amazed. Someone had built a boardwalk over top of the creek, running all the way down to the river. So I began walking down the boardwalk and looking around and seeing if I could see things that reminded me of when I grew up. And I looked up on the bluff, and there was that oak tree, and underneath the oak stood a deer, absolutely beautiful. And he kind of shook his head at me, and I kind of waved, and I kept walking down the boardwalk. And I sat on the dock by the bay, watching the tides roll away for about an hour, thinking about my life growing up. And as I was coming back up the boardwalk, in a patch of sunlight, in a field of wildflowers, lay the deer. And he was absolutely gorgeous. His antlers were in full velvet, and his eyes were like deep pools you could dive into. And he looked at me, and he looked deep into me. And I started talking to him about, this is where I grew up, and this is where, my brothers and I played, and this is where we did this, and this is where we did that. And he'd shake his head, or he'd kind of look at me odd, turn his head one way or the other. And I was beginning to get this feeling. And I said to him, "Do I know you?" And he got up and walked away. I was so disappointed that I had broken that magic spell that I was under. So I walked on around the boardwalk, and as I came around a corner, there he stood, with his head through one of the grapevine swings, and he hit it with his nose. And he hit it again, and he hit it again. And I burst into tears, because I knew at that moment that was my brother Charles telling me he loved me, and that it was going to be okay, and that he was okay. And I began talking with him about the good times when we were growing up, because there were some bad times, but there were also some really wonderful times that I shared with my siblings. And I started pulling ivy off of the tree, and I made it into a crown like we did when we were kids. And we talked, and as the sun was going down, he kind of shook his head and turned and walked away. And I needed that gift. I needed that special summer day when I would know the love of my family in a way I'd never understood before. And that memory, it's a part of me now, just like the memories of being out and running in the fields and in the woods. And that crown, that ivy is now growing in my backyard.